I'm Ian McCarthy of Lifting for Life and No Bullshit Bodybuilding, and tonight I'd like to take a couple of minutes to talk to you about why it is I am tracking my macros literally to the gram, despite the fact I'm currently bulking. And my hope is that there might be some value in me talking about this, given it seems to me over the past year or so, the evidence-based community has shifted very significantly away from rigid macro tracking and toward non-tracking flexible dieting. And I think the thought behind that is to seek out even more flexibility than macro tracking allows relative to more rigid clean eating. And I think that's an honorable objective. But I found that, and this is coming from someone who, by the way, I bulked last year eating intuitively, and I thought, hey, this is probably what I'm going to do long term. So I found myself going from IFYM to non-tracking intuitive eating and back, and I found that tracking actually works better for me. And I don't want to say that my experience is going to be the experience of everyone, but I think the benefits that I'm about to talk about will be seen, other people will have similar experiences. So I've noticed two clear benefits recently. And to provide some additional context, the reason why I stopped doing intuitive eating last year was because I decided to track macros in that period. And in the 5 weeks since the end of that cut, I never stopped tracking. And it's become increasingly evident that continuing to track was actually the right way to go for me. So one advantage of this is precision, or the degree of control that tracking macros allows you over your diet. And in hopes of illustrating this by means of an example, 2 nights ago, I made the decision to bump up my daily carb intake from 500 grams of carbs per day to 525. I felt that was appropriate given I had gained weight that week, but less than the week prior, and I just sensed that I could push it a little harder. However, yesterday it was evident that 525 was just too much. So I decided to go with 500 grams of carbs that day. Now, if I were eating intuitively, I wouldn't have been able to adjust my carbohydrate intake with that degree of precision. Now, one can say you could have just eaten less of whatever it is. Absolutely. But it might not have been literally 100 calories worth. It might have ended up being less or more, and my overall energy intake wouldn't have ended up where I wanted it to be. So I think this is an advantage both for the people who tend to get too fat when bulking and also the people who tend to undereat. Because the person who tends to get fat, if they're going to eat intuitively, now absolutely I would grant that I think with enough trial and error, they can figure out a way to make that work. But I think they're going to tend toward overeating and not realizing how much they're overeating. And I mean overeating relative to the amount of food that's ideal for them to make the progress they need to make. So, and this has definitely been true for me in the past. Like it's easy for me to eat a lot more fat than I think I'm eating without noticing, even though I can actually go pretty low fat and like not notice it. It's almost like I'm rationally aware of the fat in my diet, but in terms of how I feel, satiety, it can go way up and way down, and it's kind of the same for me. So eating intuitively, I think my fat intake skews or can skew way too high, which can mean excessive fat gain. And then again, for the person who, and this hasn't been me for a while, at least I don't recall this, the person who tends to undereat, they're going to eat intuitively. They might be really confident that they're eating 3,000 calories a day, but they're actually eating 2,400 because like that, their judgment is impaired and biased toward misjudging their energy intake as being higher than it actually is. So in tracking macros, you could, and again, I would grant there's nuance to this. You can mismeasure your food. There can be labeling errors, nothing to do even with what you're doing. Your scale could be broken. I mean, there are other variables at play here that could result in inaccurate, the actual macronutrients you're consuming not being what you think. But I think in tracking macros, you're a lot closer to, you're more reliably closer to the numbers that you're actually trying to hit, which can mean staying leaner if that's the problem you have, or making the progress you need to make if your tendency is to undereat. So, and I would reiterate over and over that you can adjust to this while practicing intuitive eating. But I think this is a more direct approach, which just gets right to the heart of the matter. And again, I would argue is more reliable. It's going to take less time to get there, less energy to get there. You'll make less mistakes in getting to that result. Something related is, and this has been really interesting for me, I've found that pushing myself to hit my macro numbers almost to the gram, and then my calorie target. And what I do with this, by the way, for those of you who are curious as to kind of the word that comes to mind is the mechanism of all of this, but I will generate macro targets and then literally multiply out those to yield calorie numbers. So I don't even go by calories on food packaging, because you'll notice that those are actually, if you multiply like the energy value of the carbs, protein, fat, they're allowed a margin for error, so the calorie number ends up not being as accurate as it could be. I'm typically like within 6 calories of my target, eating 3,800 calories per day, so that's like extreme precision. And I could, one might say, okay, is that appropriate? Do you really need that, etc.? Well, what I found is, regardless of whether or not that's physiologically appropriate, like would I ever notice any difference in muscle mass, fat mass, if it was like 3,817 instead of 3,806? I think that's highly unlikely. But it has carried over into other things I do because of the discipline it forces me to practice. One really clear, tangible example, and again, I would reiterate, this isn't going to go for everyone, but I have been more disciplined in my training because of the discipline I have to exert with my diet. Like, this is what I need to do macros-wise. And then what I found is in the gym, I will, I'll commit to whatever it is I'm going to do. And there's a lot of auto-regulation in my training, but I might say, okay, today I'm doing these, like this weight, these 2 sets, 5 reps on squats. Whereas in the past, I would be more likely to change things based on how I'm feeling. And if I'm really honest with myself, oftentimes like doing less out of feeling tired, whatever it might be, I've been much more rigid about this is my program, this is what I've committed to, this is what I need to do. And I think that's actually forced me to push through fatigue and tiredness and all of this, and has resulted in higher workload, which I think going back to the calorie thing, I don't think the 9 calorie difference is going to make a difference, but I think a 15% difference in training volume over time might actually make a significant difference in progress. And I would note, by the way, that this is still within the scope of what I can recover from, so don't think I'm like being too rigid and forcing myself to overtrain. So again, those are the 2 clear benefits I've noticed over the past 5 weeks or so of rigid macro tracking during bulking. So I think if we're to draw a very basic conclusion, it would be that you need to be aware of the context in which you're operating and figure out what works best for you, and realize there are multiple ways of approaching an issue which can work, but it comes down to which works better. It might be whether that be an issue of effectiveness or efficiency. So even though I've many times said intuitive eating is probably the thing for most people to do in the long term, I found that for me, this has actually worked better, and I sense that I will be able to sustain it. So thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you found some value in this video, and if you did, please do like it. Comment below. I'm really curious as to your experience with, if there's anyone out there who's done the same thing of going from rigid macro tracking, potentially clean eating, to rigid macro tracking, to intuitive eating, to tracking macros again and actually going, wow, I think macro tracking is the thing for me. So please do comment below. Share this video with anyone who you think might benefit from it. And I look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Thanks so much. I can't really do a bicep thing, like the thermal thing. It kind of, yeah, it's not good. Not good. Cut that. See you guys soon.